Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. A professor of classics and humanities at California State University at Fresno, Bruce Thornton is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. His latest book, The Wages of Appeasement, Ancient Athens, Munich, and Obama's America. Bruce, welcome to Uncommon Knowledge.
Thanks, Peter.
Quick opening question. Let me quote to you from your book, from The Wages of Appeasement. Quote, "Appeasement is an eternal temptation for all peoples." Why?
Well, because human nature is constant. I think the really conservative assumption of this book, which I derive from Thucydides, is that whatever external progress that people might make in technology, there still remains a certain core human nature that can be counted on to generate consistent behaviors over time. Of course, there's always differences looking over such a span. But, for example, fear, one of Thucydides' causes of conflict, is an obvious constant in human nature. And so you can use historical examples if you account for the obvious differences.
All right.
And see how illuminating they might be for your own predicament.
All right. Segment 1 then, appeasing King Philip. Philip II of Macedon, we now get into the time machine and travel back to the 4th century BC. Philip II of Macedonia, in what we would today think of as northern Greece, and in the 4th century BC is feudal, backwards, barbaric, by comparison with the city-states further south, Athens, Sparta, the other city-states. And Philip, the backward feudal king, conquers these developed city-states all the same. How come?
Well, the city-states of ancient Greece are constitutional governments. That's their great invention. That's their gift to us, is the idea of a constitutional government. But they have drawbacks. Particularly the radical democracy of Athens has drawbacks. One of the major ones, and then this is consistent all the way to our time, is that each city-state had a hard time combining with other city-states to meet a common threat. The Persian invasions of 480, they did manage to do that, but we forget that there were a lot of city-states that didn't join the coalition. They were parochial, in
just
other
a
words.
century, roughly a century earlier, 5th century BC, is the golden age. Pericles, they combined, they beat back the Persians. So within say 3 generations or so, almost within living memory, they had this great triumph to which they were able to look back, but they still weren't able to put it together again.
Right. And it's because the idea of self-rule, of citizen autonomy, was for Athens or for Sparta or for Thebes. At some occasions, they could compare their own free constitutions against an autocrat like the great king of Persia, for example. But Athens had no problem enslaving other Greeks because ultimately freedom was for Athenians. So to make coalitions, to meet a common threat was very difficult for them.
But so here, let me quote to you again from The Wages of Appeasement. "The city-states of ancient Greece, which had invented the idea of political freedom, would never be free again. The causes will be found in the destructive pursuit of self-interest." But there's a paradox there, I think, because really, correctly calculated, self-interest would have led them to coalesce, to unite against Philip. So it was, in a certain sense, it wasn't the destructive pursuit of self-interest, it was the destructive pursuit of a miscalculated...
Well, I call it short-term interest.
Short-term.
And that's partly also a reflection of the factional nature of particularly Athenian democracy. And that's one of the banes, as we see today, of any democracy. You have two sorts of interest at play. You have the interest of a city-state like Athens vis-a-vis the other city-states that it sees as competitors and rivals and ancient enemies, such as between Thebes and Athens. But within a city-state, particularly one like Athens, in which citizen participation is very broad, you have various kinds of factions vying with each other for preeminence within the state. And so it may be in the short-term interest of a faction to appease an aggressor, or even to ally with aggressor, to look, as many did to Philip, for support, financial or otherwise, for their faction. Same with states. States have short-term interests that sometimes blind them to longer-term interests.
You make a second point in the section on Philip and the city-states. Again, I'm quoting the Wages of Appeasement. Quote, "The most important factor was the decay of civic virtue. To be free, citizens have to have the character worthy of freedom."
Exactly. And that's the consistent theme throughout all three historical examples down to today.
Describe character that's worthy of freedom.
Well, you have to have certain kinds of virtues, political virtues. This involves putting the interests of the collective destiny of the state ahead of one's own interests, having an affection and a bond. Pericles in his famous funeral oration calls it love, an eros for the state. You have to feel pride in it. You have to want to hand it on to your descendants. You have to think that it's better than the alternative, not just different, but better than it.
Segment 2, Hitler, Part 1, when stopping him would have been easy. Here's Winston Churchill in 1935. "Only a few hours away by air there dwells a nation, Germany, of nearly 70 million of the most educated, industrious, scientific, disciplined people in the world, who are being taught from childhood to think of war and conquest as a glorious exercise and death in battle as the noblest fate of man. Now they are rearming with the utmost speed." Churchill, 1935, and Churchill is virtually the only major figure, not just in Britain, but in all of Europe, standing up to Hitler and warning his countrymen of what is coming. Now, 1935 is 2 years after Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Why is Churchill alone?
Well, I don't think he's completely alone. I think there are plenty of people that, don't forget Duff Cooper, who was part of Chamberlain's cabinet and resigned after Munich. The only one to resign.
Well, Munich's 1938. That's 3 years later.
But even earlier, you do have people that recognize that for 20 years Germany has been attempting to dismantle the Versailles settlement, long before Hitler comes to power. You remember the famous Marshal Falk, I think, when he heard that Versailles had been signed, he said, "This isn't peace, this is a 20-year armistice." And he was right on in terms of the number of years. There are several, I think, factors at work here. Again, we go back to Thucydides when he says that states go to war because of fear, or because of interest, or because of honor. What I do in the book is I expand the notion of honor to all the ideas that people live by. You know, we have various ideas, ideals, goals we want to pursue, aims, what we think is the good life, etc. And these include religion. Some of them are good and some of them are terrible ideas. And a lot of terrible ideas became prominent in this interwar period. Two in particular, I think, were pernicious. And we should note, because they're still around today to a lesser or greater extent. One was pacifism. In the 20s and 30s, pacifism was a huge movement, particularly in England. And partly that was the experience of the Great War, which was, you know, unprecedented in the scale of its destruction, in the role of you know, for then high-tech armaments in the destruction. It involved aerial bombardment towards the end. And there was this huge fear, particularly of aerial bombardment. And I talk about that quite a bit because it's important to imagine for the Brits, who were an island always protected by the most powerful navy in the world, now all of a sudden being an island and having a powerful navy doesn't give you that sort of security.
Right.
Because these bombers, they believe, as Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, said, the bomber always gets through.
Churchill's argument throughout this period is yes. In effect, he's saying, yes, I understand. We've just been through the horrors of the First World War, but instead of blinding us to the rearmament of Germany, it should chasten us to act now.
That's right.
The sooner we act, the easier it will be. And in fact, so there may have been others who understood this, Duff Cooper and others, but they never took power. In Britain, certainly, the dominant forces, the dominant figures, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, the entire establishment was moved toward the pacifist impulse, then they appease Hitler in Munich in 19...
Yes.
Why? Why is it the case that they're unable to see what Hitler sees?
Well,
act now, it'll be easier.
First, there's pacifism.
Right.
There's the idea anything's better than another war.
Which is sheer self-delusion.
Of course it is. Of course it is. There's other things. Second was internationalism that had been developing throughout the 19th century. The notion that globalization, global trade, greater communication technologies, all of this is creating what they called a harmony of interest among all the peoples. And war is in no one's interest. So we can create institutions, international courts of justice. We can sign treaties like the Geneva or Hague Conventions. And we can control war. We can
all this is an elaborate way of sticking their heads in the sand, of refusing to see the reality.
In effect. I mean, it's an ideal. It's idealism. It's misplaced idealism because it ignores human nature. It thinks that violence and the recourse to war is some anomaly in human nature, whereas, as Plato said, the natural state of relations between cities is war, and peace is just a name.
Peace for our time. Let's take on Munich, which is I think in popular culture and in history book after history book, the prime example. In your book, in The Wages of Appeasement, the prime modern example of appeasement. Hitler invades Austria, then he sets his sight on the Sudetenland, which is a strip of territory in Czechoslovakia.
Western Czechoslovakia.
Heavily populated by Germans, but it's lying within the sovereign state of Czechoslovakia.
That's correct. Yes.
And Neville Chamberlain, and he takes it. Hitler takes it. Neville Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister and the Italian dictator meet with Hitler in Munich, and everybody says, in effect, well, now look, Adolf, if you really, really mean it when you say this is the last time, it'll be okay with us. And Hitler says, of course I mean it.
Yes.
We will stop here. Chamberlain flies back to England, disembarks from his airplane and says, quote, "My good friends, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home."
Waving
the umbrella.
Well, no, waving the paper
waving
that
the paper,
Hitler
exactly.
signed, yes.
Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep. Close quote. What was peace with honor? Just deconstruct that. How could he have said that with a straight face at that hour?
Well, you know, one thing we have to remember when we focus in on Neville Chamberlain, Chamberlain was an absolute international hero at that moment, in those weeks after Munich. In the eyes of Franklin Roosevelt, who sent him a telegram saying, good man, in the eyes of the British people, who believed they were going to go to war, who believed that German bombers were going to start bombing their cities. And remember, it wasn't just bombs, it was incendiary bombs, it was poison gas. They had gas mask issues, they were digging trenches, they were sandbagging, they were on the brink. They believed that there was going to be a reprise of the First World War.
Only worse.
And Chamberlain had gone and he had managed to forge this peace, not just settle the issue of Czechoslovakia, which was simply to hand it into the wolfish jaws of Hitler, but this other, the paper that he waved, which Hitler signed, which said Germany and England are committed to solving their disputes without war. It's funny when I think it was Ribbentrop after he signed it, and he said, "What?" Hitler said, "Don't worry about that. That doesn't mean anything." Right. So
Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, the Nazi foreign minister.
Everybody thought he was a hero at that moment because he embodied a huge constituency that believed in these ideas that there was nothing worse than another war, that you could achieve resolution of conflict through negotiation, through diplomacy. Remember, he made 3 trips. He made 3 trips.
He worked at it.
Right. You know, the Foreign Office in England, they came up with a little ditty when, I believe it was before he went to Munich. He says, well, we must try again. And they said, well, if at first you don't concede, fly again. So he flew over there again. That was the 3rd trip. And so this seemed to confirm what for 20 years or even more, idealistic people had been saying about international relations. You don't have to go to war. But that was a profound misunderstanding of Adolf Hitler, of human nature, of the huge
By the way,
resentment.
is there no
of that.
possibility that Chamberlain was simply trying to buy time to rearm?
Well, later that's an argument that's made.
Do you buy it? That Britain,
I don't think so,
the
no.
British understood they were weak, and Chamberlain was simply, you don't buy it.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
here's why. And Churchill makes this point. And by the way, I mean, The Gathering Storm is a terrific.
The first volume of
No,
Churchill's
the first
History of the War.
history of the war. If you look, when at the Czechoslovakia crisis, if France and England had decided to fight, along with the Czechs, who had, I believe, 40 divisions, the Poles probably would have ganged up too at that moment. The Soviet Union, even if these other powers moved. France was not going to move if England didn't move. France was not going to do this on its own.
Mm-hmm.
It may have been nasty, it may have involved casualties, but Hitler would have been turned back.
Segment 4, the fall of Saigon and the rise of Tehran, the wages of appeasement. Now, I know you wrote this, Bruce, but listen to it again, because this is one of the more striking sentences in the book. By 1972, the Vietnam War was as good as won. I will repeat that.
Mm-hmm.
By 1972, the Vietnam War was as good as won. The guerrillas in the South had been neutralized, the countryside was stable, U.S. troops were going home, and the South Vietnamese were in a position to hold their own as long as they continued to have American air support and military resources, close quote. On August 30, 1975, Saigon falls to the North Vietnamese, producing the first unambiguous defeat in war that the United States of America had ever suffered. Between effective victory in 72 and total defeat in 75, what happened?
We snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, as I believe the defense minister of South Vietnam said. The political will was lost. The anti-war movement, the factional political rivalries with Nixon and the Democrats, Democratic Congress, cut the aid off that would have allowed the South to compete. Remember,
the Democratic Congress voted to stop aid.
Yeah, and the South wasn't just fighting the North; it was fighting the material and the support coming from China and the Soviet Union.
Right.
And so there's no way they could stand on their own without American air support to obliterate the masses of northern troops invading.
Now let's set this up. We've talked about the Greek city-states in the 4th century, and they had trouble uniting to ward off an invader. Then we've talked about Munich and appeasement of Hitler, and that was a question again of this could be terrible, we just can't fix.
Right.
But this is different. This is the United States having won, having done what was necessary for more than a decade, and then giving it all up.
But a lot of people didn't know they'd won. I mean, the popular perception of the war as it had been presented, the mismanagement.
Presented by?
Well, not just the media, but also the government. And the mismanagement of the political dimension of the war by the Johnson administration particularly, and not doing a better job of explaining to people how exactly this was becoming a success. You know, the perception of the war was up to 68, and the mistakes up to then became the whole war. But the successes after 68, Creighton Abrams, and the change, all that was
the change
lost.
From Westmoreland, who failed, to Abrams, who actually figured it out. Abrams was, in effect, the Petraeus figure. He actually went in and fixed it, and nobody in the United States cottoned on to it.
You know, we had the image created by the media, by the anti-war movement, by the leftists in the universities, etc., that this was a neo-imperialist, unjust, illegal war, that the idea of communist expansionism was a myth created by corporations in order to sell weapons, etc.
So what you've got
here, that narrative took hold, and I'm not even sure at that point that facts would have made any difference. You know, once the narrative takes hold in people's imaginations.
But so let me put this to you then as you're not saying that the American people gave up.
No, I think the polling shows that they didn't.
They didn't
very
give
late.
up,
No.
right? What you're saying is that some sort of elite, I don't want to say they were elitist. Lyndon Johnson was an ordinary man from a poor part of Texas all his life. In fact, he felt resentment toward the eastern elites. But some small group in power, the people who were responsible for the narrative, the press, the government, got it wrong and confused the American people, misled the American people? Did they get it willfully? What happened? Why did they get it wrong?
Well, because there was a larger narrative that still works today that I think is pernicious, and it's the whole ultimately Marxist inspired idea of imperialism and colonialism as the world historical crimes, unique, horrible crimes, and that, you know, that's what you fit the Cold War into from their perspective. I mean, from the perspective of many on the left, that this was a neo-imperialist attempt to reestablish the colonial power.
Fall of Saigon in 1975, Tehran, Iran, the Iranian Revolution, 1979. The Shah stands up to the turmoil in the streets. He seems to back down. He stands up. There's some vacillation back, but the critical moment takes place when the President of the United States, James Earl Carter, in effect says to the Shah, we're withdrawing our support. And the Shah leaves the country, and this popular uprising, unclear whether it was so popular in the first place, but what very quickly happens is that it goes from Bani Sadr, who seems some way or another to represent the popular forces, to Ayatollah Khomeini, who is not a popular figure at all, but a theocrat. And we are still, and far more to the point, the Iranian people are still paying the price. So what happened with Jimmy Carter?
Again, it wasn't just Carter. It was many in the State Department, in the foreign policy establishment. I think a lot of it was the failure to take religion seriously. The failure to see that what was going on in Iran was a religious revolution. And it's interesting to go back and see the way Khomeini is presented. You remember the Time magazine cover? It looks like Charles Manson.
I confess I don't, but all right.
Yeah, well, I mean, the notion is sort of like, well, there's this wacky guy there, this guy with this funny beard and this Manson-like stare, and he's got all these fanatics together. But the secularists, whether they're the communists or the secularists or the liberal Democrats, they're going to use him and his support, of which he had a lot, right? They'll provide maybe the shock troops, and then they'll settle down as good pragmatists and realize they have to integrate into the international order, and they have to have trade and sign agreements, and they'll be somebody we can work with. And there was plenty of evidence about the religious nature of the resistance to the Shah, right? It wasn't his corruption, it wasn't the lethality of the Savak, which the mullahs in 1 year, surpassed their toll in their whole existence. It was his modernization efforts, which his father had started even earlier, that the clerical religious establishment and many religious people resisted and did not like because it was against Islam.
Segment 5. Now, having taken this long tour of appeasement through history, we come to Barack Obama's America. The wages of appeasement. Quote, the trajectory of appeasement that had begun in Saigon in 1975 and then proceeded through Tehran in 1979 was now pointing to New York in 2001.
Exactly.
Explain that.
The perception changed of the Vietnam War. And this is something that people have to understand about a great power. A great power is great not just because it has resources, it's because people think it's great. And what does that mean on the international stage? It means that it will defend its interests, that it will reward its friends, that it will punish its enemies. It has prestige. After Vietnam, we no longer had that prestige. The Soviet Union went on a rampage of geopolitical opportunism throughout the world. We began to retreat. We had this crisis of confidence, as the president in his Notre Dame speech, sometimes that's called the malaise speech. I think
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, the crisis of confidence.
He referred to an, quote, inordinate fear of communism.
Right. And we were guilty. We were neo-imperialists. We were battling the
Okay, but between all of that and 2001, you get Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. You get 12 years of more or less conservative presidents who are spending a lot on defense, standing up to the Soviet Union. Wrapping up the Cold War.
Yes.
Reestablishing the American economic growth, and with it, American prestige, right?
Right, except when it came to Iran and it came to Iran's assaults and the Marine barracks bombing in 83.
83 in Lebanon.
That, I mean, if there's one thing, and I know you're a Ronald Reagan guy, but that was the biggest mistake that was made, is not to punish. That was Iran. That was Hezbollah, or what would become Hezbollah, trained, financed by the Iranians. Iran declared war on us. Khomeini declared war on the United States in 1979, and they have been at war with us ever since. And that was the assault on our troops that went unpunished. And if you go and you look at the writings of Zawahiri and bin Laden, and they're exhorting their trainees, they come back to these over and over again. They ran from Saigon, they ran from Beirut, they ran from Mogadishu, right? Black Hawk Down story.
Right.
They will always run because they're spiritually corrupt, and all of their power and their wealth and their military power, that doesn't mean anything because they don't have any beliefs, any spiritual beliefs. That's their perception. And and we can say, well, that perception's incorrect.
George H.W. Bush didn't run away from Iraq when they...
No, that's what, see, that's what was, let me confess, I don't care that there weren't any WMDs, okay?
I'm talking about George H.W. Bush, the first...
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because I'm just trying to get you to get us up to 2001.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so 2001, despite wrapping up the Cold War, standing up to the Soviet Union, despite driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, the terrorists still look at us and say, with regard to us, with regard to the terrorists, the United States is still weak. That's the argument.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they feel emboldened.
Sure,
We get the terrorist attack of 9/11.
And what do we, listen, they beat in their worldview, and what we have to do is think about in their worldview, they beat the Soviets too in Afghanistan.
Right. They used our Stinger missiles
of course,
and material, but still.
What it's sold
they
as,
were the ones who did the fighting.
So big deal, you stood up to the Soviet Union, right? Look at us, a little ragtag band of mujahideen, in Afghanistan. We took them on and we beat them too. So the next step now is the second world hegemon that interferes with Islam's destiny, which is the United States.
The wages of appeasement. Quote, President Obama believes in the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council, and treaties like the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, in the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, in multilateral cooperation. But the regimes with which he wishes to engage do not.
No.
Explain.
No. Look, a weak tyrant or illiberal regime, or whatever you want to call it, of course, they will participate in all these international sorts of institutions because they can become an instrument for the weak in their relationships with the strong. They will tell the world, when they know the world is listening, what they think the world wants to hear, that they believe in, this sort of diplomacy, and they believe in sitting down and having, I mean, who was the great genius of that? Yasser Arafat. He would tell us everything we wanted to hear, all of our roadmaps, all of our conferences, while at the same time in Arabic to his people, he's talking about jihad, from the river to the sea.
You've got to give Barack Obama high marks for prosecuting the war in Afghanistan, though.
Oh, no question. No question.
Okay.
I'm astonished that what I'm astonished by, since you brought that up, is how his base on the left have swallowed that. Because, on the one hand, we're going to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in New York, but President Obama is judge, jury, and executioner in Afghanistan when he has a predator go in and blast a compound, and we don't know who's in that compound.
Okay, so but Barack Obama takes office, and he says he's going to shut down Guantanamo. He hasn't shut down Guantanamo. They're going to try all the bad guys, and that's not going to happen. Yeah. So you have to say, one, Barack Obama has prosecuted the war in Afghanistan, and he's done what General Petraeus has advised him to do. Two, he's backed off some of the crazier things that he intended, shutting down Guantanamo. I mean, you could say he's grown in office. Three, although he's talked a certain talk about international cooperation and so forth, these international agencies that you mentioned, when it comes right down to it, his actions haven't been that bad.
No, but what he does with the right hand, he undoes with the left. Again, in the realm of perception, which is important, the speech in Cairo, which was a disastrous groveling, speech, as well as being woefully historically inaccurate. This failure to, recognize the roots of jihadist terror in traditional Islam, the courtship, and let's face it, he's not the only one that did this. The Bush administration is guilty of some of the same things, of the Muslim people thinking that, well, gee, if we tell them how much we admire their wonderful religion, they'll start to like us. I mean, those sorts of things have compromised the effectiveness. But the worst thing is, in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq, is saying there's an end date here.
Final question, Bruce, and this brings us back again to your subtitle, Wages of Appeasement, Ancient Athens, Munich, and Obama's America. If you could give one or two sentences of advice to Barack Hussein Obama, who will, after all, remain president for 2 more years and maybe for 6, what would you say?
Listen to what the Islamists say and believe that they mean what they say, and that it is a spiritual good to them, and spiritual goods cannot be traded for material goods. You cannot bribe them. And I would have told the same thing to George Bush. You're not going to bribe them. It's not going to be political freedom, the right to vote, more cable channels, more apps for your iPhones. These are people who inhabit a spiritual world of ultimate goods, of a relationship with their God, of responsibilities and obligations. When we disparage that and say that it's a distortion, that it's some sort of neuroses, that they don't really mean it, that they're just totalitarians, we completely fail to understand the people who want to destroy us. And until we take them at their word, I don't believe we will be able to come up with the right sorts of policies.
Take them at their word, and then do what about it?
Realize that there's not going to be any resolution outside of force.
Take them at their word and then rain predator drones down on them.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah. As I say, they always tell us we love death more than you love life. Then we should just give them what they love and show them that we mean it.
Bruce Thornton, author of The Wages of Appeasement. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.